Welcome to the Ticktective podcast and video series, a program of the Bay Area Lyme Foundation, where our mission is to make Lyme disease easy to diagnose and simple to cure. I'm your host, Leah Gertner, Director of Education and Outreach. Lyme disease is the most common vector-borne disease in the USA and is a global issue. This show includes interviews with the researchers we fund, as well as other interesting people in the Lyme scientific community. We are a nonprofit foundation based in Silicon Valley. Thanks to a generous grant that covers all of our overhead, 100% of all donations go directly to support research and prevention programs. You can find out more or donate at bayarealyme.org. Thank you, Kris Newby, for joining us on the Ticktective video and podcast series today.
Thanks, Leah. Thanks for having me on.
Kris Newby is an award-winning science and technology writer and the senior producer of the Lyme disease documentary Under Our Skin, which premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival and was a 2010 Oscar semifinalist. Her book, Bitten, The Secret History of Lyme Disease and Biological Warfare, won a 2019 Silver Nautilus Book Award in Journalism and Investigative Reporting and the top 2020 International Book Award for Narrative Nonfiction. Kris's book, Bitten, investigates why Lyme disease is so difficult to both diagnose and to treat, and why the government has been reluctant to classify chronic Lyme as a disease. Kris has 2 degrees in engineering, a bachelor's degree from the University of Utah and a master's degree from Stanford University. Previously, Kris Newby worked for Stanford University, Apple, and has worked for other Silicon Valley companies. So Kris, I'm wondering, how did you move from being a Stanford engineer to writing and producing Under Our Skin and writing the book Bitten?
Well, I've been a long time Silicon Valley resident. I started out as an engineer here and then went into technical marketing. And then I ran a tech consultancy where I did mostly tech writing. And I was on that career path. And then my husband and I went to Martha's Vineyard with our family when our 2 young boys were in middle school. And we came back with lousy t-shirts and a horrible disease, an unknown disease. And it took us a year, 10 doctors and $60,000 to get diagnosed with Lyme disease and babesiosis, which is caused by a malaria-like red blood cell infection. And that's when I think it was a major course correction in my life. And I became really interested in Lyme disease, why it was so controversial, why it was so misdiagnosed. And it started this, which is an almost 20-year search for answers. And really, as an engineer, I have a strong desire to understand and fix complex problems that are really messy and multifactorial. So that's why I'm here today with a film and a book on Lyme disease.
So you dove into the really messy and politically charged and complicated, and some might say dangerous topics around Lyme disease, how Lyme disease may have originated, what the government has been doing about the epidemic, and so much more. So first of all, I commend you on being a very brave person. And second of all, can you tell us about what you found out doing the research for Bitten?
Yeah, so I guess it started out with a confession of sorts from Willy Burgdorfer, who is the Lyme disease discoverer as far as the organism that causes Lyme disease. And he said sort of a shocking thing when the director, Andy Wilson, and I were filming him for the documentary. And he implied that there were secrets around Lyme disease that he didn't tell us about. So that was my first inkling. Later on, I circled back and he said he believed that the organism he was investigating in the mid-70s, he wasn't telling everything about that organism, that there was a second organism and that it was related to biological weapons accident. So that sort of started me on the path of really looking into this really large biological weapons program, which included weaponization of fleas, ticks, and mosquitoes. And starting with that admission by Willy Burgdorfer, because he had the most to lose by saying, well, there were lies associated with that discovery and I was complicit in the cover-up. And so what I discovered is there was this biological weapons program during the Cold War that was as big as the Manhattan Project and as secretive. And an arm of that was stuffing these fleas, ticks, and mosquitoes with horrible diseases and dropping them on our enemies. And then later on, they removed the insects from the equation and just started freeze drying and spraying these organisms that could be carried by ticks. And so I wrote this book, and it's sort of some esoteric, dry history. So I tried to make it engaging, and I weaved in two stories: one of my family's plight and the struggles that we went through to get treated and recover our health. And then the interesting history of Willy Bergdorfer, who, came over from Switzerland in 1951, really ambitious. He was trained as a medical zoologist and a parasitologist. His goal in life was to save people from horrible bug-borne diseases. And when he came here, he was soon enlisted by the Public Health Service, which later became NIH, to develop insect-borne weapons of mass destruction. So I lucked into a lot of his private lab books and letters, and I wrote the story of his transformation from an ambitious young scientist to being sort of this evil mad scientist working with the weapons program in Fort Detrick. And then later in life, getting Lyme disease himself and gaining more empathy for the patients and confessing to me and a couple other journalists his involvement in this program.
I know that there's a lot of negative connotation when people say conspiracy theory. It brings to mind things that don't have the amount of solid research and documentation of what you're talking about. So can you share with us the means in which you got these documents? I know some of them are public, and I know that a lot of the documents are on your website under documents, and it's frightening to see the government documents that supported biological warfare. But some of the records that you based this narrative on are public, and some were privately provided to you. Can you share a little bit about that?
Well, first of all, I'm an engineer, so I'm very fact-based. And then I worked for almost a decade writing science stories with Stanford. So I feel like I've been classically trained on not overreaching in my conclusions and saying, these are the facts. This is what we know. This is what we don't know. And this is what I think happened, but we need more research. So the whole book, that's the framework for that. So I think it's not conspiracy theory. I'm presenting the facts as best we know it now. And hopefully other journalists and scientists will run with it. That's my goal. It started with a confession from Willy. And then also by luck, I met a CIA black ops guy who actually dropped infected ticks on Cuban sugar workers in 1962 as part of a CIA black ops program to oust dictator Fidel Castro. So I got enough details from him, and then the Kennedy assassination files were released, and I could corroborate what he said, and that's in the book. Supposedly NIH gathered all of Willy's scientific papers and images and put them in the National Archives in Maryland, and I went to see that as soon as it was released. There were key sections of his research that were missing. It was obvious there were hardly any details or images about his Lyme disease discovery, which seems odd since that's what he was most famous for. So I went back to Willy in Montana, where he lived, and that's where he told me his first job he had worked in the biological weapons program for over a decade, and his first job was putting plague into fleas as a weapon. So plague, a disease that has almost wiped out the human race several times, figuring out how to stuff the fleas with the plague so that it can be dropped from bomblets over battalion-sized areas. So he did that. He worked on mass producing mosquitoes and filling them with a very deadly yellow fever, supposedly as a weapon used in the tropics. And then he said he tried to mass produce ticks, get them to reproduce more. And then he worked on various programs to try and stuff diseases in the ticks. He would create long, thin glass pipettes and shove them down the mouths of ticks. He'd press the ticks in clay so they wouldn't wiggle away. And then he would try to get diseases like Venezuelan equine encephalitis virus, rabies virus, tularemia, and leptospirosis, which is a spirochetal disease or bacterium somewhat similar to Lyme disease. And try to get those established in ticks so then they could be mass produced, fed these diseases, and dropped on enemies like the US did on Cuba.
Your book, Bitten, inspired Congressman Kris Smith to petition the government to release documents from that era around biological warfare and research in the Department of Defense on tick-borne diseases and related research. Can you tell us about the story around Representative Kris Smith's proposal and what's happened with it?
So when the book first came out, May 2019, Kris Smith read about it. He represents New Jersey, and that's especially hard hit with all the tick-borne diseases. So he waved it in front of C-SPAN while they were in the middle of deciding on the Defense Department budget. And he said, I just read this book, Bitten. It's really credible. I think we need to declassify all the documents related to bug-borne weapons. Because the point I try to make by the end of the book is this tick-borne weapon program was just a small part of a really, really large program. It's almost mind-boggling how large it was and how out of control, with no environmental protection oversight or bioethical oversight. So, with Lyme disease, it's just a really strange origin story when you get back to the detail. And that's the secret history of Lyme disease I talk about. It wasn't just the Lyme disease spirochete that was making people sick starting in the late 60s around Long Island and Lyme, Connecticut, and New York. It was 3 really freaky tick-borne diseases. And there could have been a virus in there too that they didn't really have equipment to detect, but there was, of course, Lyme arthritis that was first had hot spots in Lyme, Connecticut. On Long Island, there was a horrible Rocky Mountain spotted fever epidemic that was killing people. Like, for 20 years, it hadn't killed people. And then all of a sudden there were, I think, 157 dead people on Long Island. That really raised some alarms. And then there was babesiosis. So that's this formerly only in cattle parasite that crossed over to man, red blood cells. And all of these diseases were carried by ticks, and you could get them at the same time. When Willie said, oh, Lyme disease is it, the public health services said, okay, this battle is one and done. And they brushed the babesia and the spotted fever under the rug. A lot of these were top secret programs. And we need to really release the original documents of what the military people released, what germs, what insects they released in what areas. So we know with Lyme disease, there's hot spots in Wisconsin area, Great Lakes area, and then there's the Lyme, New York hotspots. So like, open those records. They are locked in Fort Detrick's a little basement, release them, let us know, let the scientists know what was released where and when. And it might be clues to all these mysterious, freaky autoimmune diseases, multiple sclerosis and Alzheimer's, because it would save so much money in research dollars. And most of the people that authorize those programs are dead now. So we'll worry about liability either. But if the government did these really unethical experiments, open air, they need to come clean now, because the public health impacts are huge, long lasting, not just humans, but all mammals. In my book, I call it the American Chernobyl.
So the theory is that if we understood exactly the origins of these pathogens, that we would better be able to come up with a therapeutic or prevention for them.
Or environmental controls. I would say it's been about 50 years since these experiments happened. And there's no simple solution right now. There needs to be like a multi-faceted approach to controlling it, which means, tick prevention in the environment, prevention as far as when people go outside, better diagnostics, better treatments for the people who are already sick, and vaccines, though I think the emphasis on vaccines is overrated.
So the information that you have is not completely conclusive, but would your idea from the information in the documents that you have be more of an accidental exposure from a lab, or part of these experiments that they didn't understand might have these kinds of consequences when they started doing them?
So my book primarily focuses on the outbreak around Lyme, Connecticut. There are other accidents that I document as proof of a history of unfortunate events associated with the biological weapons program. So, I mean, I take Willie at his word that he said accidents happen. So there was some sort of accident. He wouldn't go as far as to tell me what it is, but I can list some of the things that are drivers of that. I think the biggest impact in that area was that in the late 60s, a scientist, an entomologist, vet at Old Dominion University, that's right near Norfolk, Virginia, did a series of open air releases of hundreds of thousands of ticks that had been radiated. So he would take a pregnant tick, inject it with radioactive fluid. It would lay its 2,000 to 3,000 eggs, and then those nymph ticks would be radioactive for their whole lives. Then he took several fields in Virginia and gridded them off. And in each square, he put 1,000 ticks, radioactive ticks. Then he and his assistants would go out every month and collect the ticks in each square. And this is like huge acres, hectare area. He would collect the ticks in one bottle that were in this square, take it back to the lab and measure the levels of radioactivity. So from that, he could tell how far the radioactive ticks marched per month. And why would you do that? Well, if you're using it as a weapon, you want to know if you dump these on the enemy, how far will the disease that you inject them with spread? So that coastal Virginia experiment, I believe, caused the large number of Rocky Mountain spotted fever deaths in Long Island because he released this Lone Star tick, which was non-native in the Northeast at that time. And it's a much more aggressive man-biting tick than the deer ticks that were in, the Northeast there. And he released them on the Atlantic bird fly zone so that when he would release these ticks and put them back in the squares after he Geiger countered them, coastal birds migrating from South America up through the Caribbean, up the coast to Canada would pick up these ticks and spread them. So pretty much 2 years after these experiments, there was a huge outbreak of Lone Star ticks on Long Island. And Lone Star ticks carry two nasty diseases, spotted fever and the alpha-gal allergy, meat allergy, red meat allergy. So I believe that whatever ticks he released there hitched rides on birds, and then it created sort of this storm of tick diseases that area had never seen. I mean, I have letters from the people there going, oh my gosh, the tick season is so bad. And then the body bags from spotted fever, which is the most deadly tick-borne disease in the US. So that's just one example of the crazy experiments they did then. They also put tick-borne tularemia in ticks and released them in Alaska in remote areas. And, I didn't really look into the impact of that, but it certainly would affect animals in that area.
Earlier, you said only the bioweapons defense program is still active. Can you elaborate the difference between then and now?
All indications are that we're not doing any offensive biological weapons research in the US, but we are doing defensive work because we being the United States believes that other rogue states are doing it. So our labs have to keep samples of that, of like anthrax and smallpox and tularemia and botulism, so we can figure out ways to detect it before it's released or spreads widely. In biosecurity circles, they call that the dual use, in that if you have tiny samples, you can always restart relatively easy an offensive program, but technically we're not doing it. The biological weapons program was almost as large and definitely as secretive as the Manhattan nuclear project. So all the information was very compartmentalized. Our top 50 universities did little pieces of the biological weapons research, and most of them didn't know what they were doing. They would cloak the true purpose with a deceptive objective for the grant proposal. They took Rickettsia rickettsii, which is spotted fever, and they grew the rickettsias in large vats or flasks, freeze dried it, and then aerosolized it and sprayed it on monkeys. And they measured like the fatal dose and how long it took to kill the monkeys. And on the surface, it was just, oh, we want to protect the lab workers. So we know how much aerosolized rickettsial will hurt lab workers. But I mean, really, it was, they wanted to spray it on enemies. That's rickettsia was on the bioweapons agent list at Fort Detrick. And so, but the people at Ohio State didn't know that.
I mean, at some point, those people will age out and it'll be looking back at the history of something that was before our time, that was outdated, and there won't be as much fear to protect those secrets, right?
Well, I think the fear of lawsuits is a real and present danger for them. Any money that goes to law settlements won't go to the universities and the government labs. So you look at Tuskegee experiment where they injected syphilis into, and they did not treat African-American soldiers. You know, those, finally that group got settlement. Agent Orange, the soldiers, so Agent Orange was part of the biological and chemical weapons program, is the defoliant that was sprayed in Vietnam. And it turned out it caused a lot of cancers and autoimmune issues with the sailors who, and the Air Force people who deployed it. And then not to mention our enemies that it was sprayed on. So birth deformities, et cetera. So that finally had some sort of legal actions just recently. So confessing these sins of our Cold War past will be very expensive.
That might segue into the discussion around the origins of COVID and the Wuhan virology lab. Do you have thoughts about that?
I mean, nobody knows right now the origins of it. It seems to me that it's a strange enough mutation that it feels unnatural to me, but you know, we won't know for a while. There was a delegation that just went to China to investigate that, but they were really controlled in where they went and what samples they got. This is the WHO investigation. And people in our own government said, well, that's not good enough. So part of what I did in this book was, the central question I was exploring is, the discoverer of Lyme disease, Willy Burgdorfer, said that he believes that an organism that was released, not necessarily Borrelia burgdorferi, in that area accidentally caused the sickness that broke out there. So I sort of did the deep dive. When a biosecurity person investigates this, what are the clues that they look for that something like this is happening? Well, I'll tell you these clues and you can see how they sort of apply to COVID and Lyme disease. And well, these three organisms that were released in the Lyme disease area. So, you know, a point source, really an outbreak that's a point source. You know, it doesn't seem like a normal mutation. And certainly COVID started in Wuhan and Lyme disease started around Lyme, Connecticut and Wisconsin. It's a highly unusual disease. Lyme disease was really novel and it caused a great deal of alarm, especially in the mid-70s, this crazy swelling of joints and the fatigue and the brain fog. It was really unusual. And then COVID, it's got the crazy loss of taste and smell, which my husband has now. And it's really devastating for the people who have it. And it's just, and it's so contagious. The experts say it could be worse, which I believe, but it's just shut down the whole world. So it's bad, you know. And then the other thing is unusual morbidity and mortality. And certainly we've seen that with both COVID and Lyme disease. Morbidity being significant illness that lasts a while and mortality being death.
Under our skin has made a profound impact on the Lyme disease world. It's the first thing that a lot of patients turn to when they're looking for answers.
I mean, what drove me is I just realized that my husband and my experience with Lyme disease wasn't an unusual one-off. It wasn't that we just got a bad set of doctors or California doctors are clueless about Lyme disease. It was happening across the US. And it just turned out that Andy Abraham Wilson in Sausalito had started a documentary at the same time I was thinking about it. So we just joined forces and it was good because he's just a really good filmmaker and I'm, you know, a really good researcher. So we worked together and really that, I was still sick when I did it. And that experience impacted me greatly because I just saw the injustices of how people were being treated across the US and then how large the epidemic was. No one knew, but we talked to hundreds and hundreds of people and the most heartbreaking stories like, oh, my whole family has Lyme disease. We just sold our last couch so we can afford one more month of antibiotics for us so that we can actually, go to work and feed our family. Just horrible, horrible stories. Marriages breaking up, parents arrested for treating their kids with antibiotics. My life felt sort of superficial before that happened. And it said, well, this is a problem that I can work on. I can make some progress. Unfortunately, it's been slower than I thought, but I'll keep going.
Talking about how people sold their last couch to pay for treatment. Did you come up with any answers as to why insurance won't cover a lot of Lyme treatment?
In its late stages, it's really, really expensive. So when you have major research physicians at, I would say it's a dozen research physicians who focused on Lyme saying chronic Lyme doesn't exist, and they're from universities that are like Yale and Harvard, then it's easy for the insurance companies to say, yeah, we're with them because it saves us money.
Because they can't save money for really expensive diseases like cancer that they have to pay for. But those ones are harder to shirk than this one.
Yeah, and everything about Lyme disease is gray area. It's got flu-like symptoms that are non-specific unless you're lucky enough, unless you're the 30 to 50% of people that see the Lyme rash or even get it. And then there's no good test for it early on. As Bay Area Lyme Foundation is finding out, there's different strains of Borrelia in California. So a lot of people have been sick with a Lyme-like disease, but the tests that we use, which are based on the East Coast version, don't read positive for the people on the West Coast. I talked to an exec at Empire Blue, or I read the transcript, I think, of Empire Blue Cross in New York, and they were about to IPO their HMO, and they looked at what diseases were the most expensive. First was AIDS, second was Lyme disease. So, that was on their hit list for places to deny coverage. And the way around that is just get better diagnostics, a better symptom list that's more accurate. What we have now in the IDSA guidelines is doesn't represent what I've seen in the field, talking to now it's thousands of Lyme patients.
Can you talk about how you perceive the CDC reacting to Lyme and COVID might be similar or different?
Well, anyone who has had long-term Lyme is well versed in the flaws of the CDC. And I think we've seen those same flaws rear their ugly heads. It's sort of like with Lyme disease, it's such a slow progressing disease. It wasn't obvious to people that haven't suffered from the disease. But with COVID, there's so many deaths, it sort of broke the dam as far as really revealing what was wrong with it. And so I'll just go through the highlights of how CDC has failed both Lyme and COVID. First of all, is just flawed testing. In the beginning, CDC with COVID had a bad test and they were really slow to admit it. They were slow to accept a better test from Europe. With Lyme disease, we know that there is no good reliable test in the first month of the disease. And once it progresses well beyond a month, you risk like 15 to 20% of the people going on to be chronically ill. And it's an indirect test, which is antibody test, not a direct DNA test like many other diseases like AIDS. We have a direct DNA test, so it's very, very reliable. Lyme disease patients and their physicians are flying in the dark. Then you have fragmented disease tracking. Disease tracking for Lyme disease was designed in the early 80s, and when it was in a very small circle, it requires a two-step test. They can take a patient over a month to get the results from. Then it requires that local physician to fill out a lengthy questionnaire and send it to their county health department. And then the county health department has to compile that and call the physician and verify that it really was Lyme disease, and then send it to national. That's such a time-consuming process compared to AIDS, where you have just a tiny little postcard or online form and the tests are reliable. We have had horrible tracking, and you can tell that because until just a few years ago, CDC said, oh, there's 30,000 cases in a year. And then they revised it and said, well, it's not really 30,000. Our experts have re-reviewed the data and it's 300,000 a year. And then this year they came out and said, well, it's really closer to 500,000 a year now. So they're slowly admitting that their tracking sucks. And this is the case with COVID too. We haven't, compared to other countries, we've done a lousy job of contact tracing, which is, figuring out how the disease is spreading and where it is and where the strains are. And the other thing that's been really devastating to Lyme disease patients is an inaccurate list of symptoms. So it helps doctors diagnose people. Like in the beginning of the COVID outbreak, a lot of people were talking about this loss of taste and smell. And they said, no, it's just the cough. A year later, it turns out not everybody gets the cough and it's not even that widespread. And the loss of taste and smell is actually the most definitive symptom. With Lyme disease, the swelling of joints was, because it was discovered, by a group of rheumatologists initially, they hyper-focused on joints. And anybody who's had Lyme disease know the joints just happen to some people. What's really devastating is the invasion of the neurological system, especially the brain, and which is hard to measure. And then the final thing is test rationing. With COVID, there weren't enough tests. We weren't ready. And so we really didn't have a good idea of how far it was spreading. And with Lyme disease, they have this two-step really inaccurate test. And there's been this propaganda from a certain number of academic researchers that say Lyme disease is really rare. So be careful before you waste your money on a test. And because they've been told that chronic Lyme doesn't exist, they wait and see, before testing, rather than saying, and we really need to test right away, because the cost of that test is nothing compared to someone who goes on to be year to 5 years with this devastating neurological disease.
Which brings me to my question about the Texas Tory lawsuit against the Infectious Disease Society of America. Can you tell us what you know around that Tory lawsuit?
Yeah, so Lisa Torrey is a nurse who's in Texas who got Lyme disease, and Texas thinks they don't have Lyme disease there for some reason. So her treatment was systematically delayed, and now she's so sick she can't work in her chosen profession. So she's the first to really mount a very large class action suit with a bunch, I think, over 20 patients in similar situations. And it's gone the farthest so far in the courts. It involved, I think, 8 insurance companies and then the Infectious Diseases Society of America and a few of their doctors. So it's been going on about 3 years now, and the insurance companies have settled for an undisclosed amounts, but the Infectious Diseases Society of America and the main doctors that really publish their Lyme treatment guidelines, which again say Lyme disease can be cured with 2 to 4 weeks of one single antibiotic. In some cases, they said it can be cured with 2 pills of doxycycline, even though the CDC says that's not valid. And the case goes to trial finally, I think, in September. And it's important because it will provide precedence to other patients who've been treated that way. And if you're involved in the Lyme community, they're just like thousands and thousands of them. And it's really, really scary to the Infectious Diseases Society of America and their Lyme guidelines author, because it sets them up for civil suits from now until the end of their lives. But it is important because people really need to look carefully at these guidelines, because a lot of truly sick people fall through the cracks and go on to be sick for the rest of their lives. They lose their houses, they lose their jobs, they lose health insurance, their marriages break up. It's just really costly to society. And we need to relook at everything about the disease, redo the science with fresh eyes that are unbiased.
What kind of advice do you have for Lyme patients out there who've been having trouble getting adequately treated or even diagnosed?
Well, I just would say get a second or third opinion. and try to find someone open-minded and experienced in tick-borne diseases, because they're super complicated, just like AIDS is, and or some esoteric brain tumor. So if you had like some rare glioblastoma brain tumor, you would find someone who had treated a lot of those patients before. And so I would go to one of the many patient-centric websites like LymeDisease.org and look for an experienced doctor in your area. And don't try to change the mind of someone who has been indoctrinated with old information on the disease.
Do you think there's hope in updating the information that is available to doctors and patients? How do you think that'll happen?
Well, right now there's two sets of guidelines. The most widely used were just released this year, Infectious Diseases Society of America, and many of the lead authors on that are named in this malpractice lawsuit for Lyme disease. For some reason, the IDSA didn't think that that's a conflict of interest. And then there's also another set of guidelines that's really written by in the field clinicians who've seen a lot of Lyme disease patients. So they're warring guidelines, and it's just very confusing for frontline physicians to know what to follow. So part of what we covered in our documentary on Lyme disease, which was Under Our Skin, released in 2008, was the political controversy in the formation of these guidelines. And actually in 2007, the Attorney General of Connecticut basically sued the Infectious Diseases Society of America for having these inaccurate guidelines. And they settled out of court, and the IDSA agreed to rewrite the guidelines. So I thought that that's a change for the better, but they just didn't significantly rewrite them at all. And so we basically have the same set of guidelines that let patients fall through the cracks and go on to get chronically ill. So I don't know how to fix that. A documentary, a book, an attorney general lawsuit. Now there's a class action suit. To me, change isn't happening fast enough.
Well, our organization aims to try to expedite that change, and we're really grateful for people like you who are willing to speak out and help find the truth and try to make positive change. So thank you so much for joining us today on the Ticktective podcast and video series, Kris Newby.
All right, and thanks for all your work, because I know Bay Area Lyme Foundation does a lot of really good investments in research, since the government isn't funding sort of the right things for patient priorities. That's helpful. And also you have an associated group that's working to get more funding at NIH for these tick-borne diseases. So that's awesome too. So thank you.
Yeah, that's the Center for Lyme Action.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks, Leah, for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Ticktective podcast and video series, a program of the Bay Area Lyme Foundation. You can find out more or donate at bayarealyme.org.